Hello and welcome to Old Lang Schmooze, the Edinburgh Jewish Culture Centre podcast. I'm Ian Neville, and in this episode I'm hoping to find out all about the magazine Jewish Renaissance. Jewish Renaissance is a quarterly magazine. It's summer 2023, and in their latest issue they've got a major feature on the Jewish communities in Scotland. So, it's Thursday morning and I'm here with Rebecca Taylor, the editor of the Jewish Renaissance magazine. I'm hoping to find out all about the magazine, how they put it together. Rebecca, thanks very much for taking part in this podcast.
Pleasure. Lovely to meet you, David.
You've agreed to do this podcast and you've agreed to do it now because I believe you've just put the latest edition of the magazine to bed, as they say. In other words, you've sent it off to the printers. How does that feel?
Well, it feels a massive relief. That's my first instinct. It's very hard work at the end of the production process. It's very intense. And myself and my designer, the magazine designer, Becky Redman, can be up weeks beforehand, usually weekends and evenings, because she has a full-time job. Apart from us, she fits us into the evenings. So it can get quite late and everything else gets put aside. So I don't cook very much. I don't do much housework. Some might say that that's not much different from usual, but everything gets put on hold, and I just have really usually about two, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on where we're at with it, but very intensive few weeks where we just focus on designing the magazine. And we're a tiny team as well. I mean, it's very much myself and her in those last few weeks where we're working on it very intensely and intensively together, trying out things on the pages. I mean, I love it, actually. It's quite full on, but I love the process of getting these articles, these wonderful articles that people have written or interviews that we've done with people, and actually seeing how they can be brought to life on the page, which Becky, because she's such a talented, skillful designer, she does consummately, beautifully, wonderfully well. And it's always very exciting when I give her the copy. That's we'll start a few weeks beforehand. I'll give her the copy, and then she begins to lay it out and put the pictures with it, illustrations, and arrange it on the page, and then comes back to me, and I can have a say, maybe this doesn't quite work, or these images aren't quite right. So yes, we go through this very intense process, and then especially the few days before, where I, in particular, am proofing like mad because I'm completely paranoid about spelling mistakes and typos. Because we're a quarterly, I feel very much we have to get it right, really. We are a small team, but we are only a quarterly, so really I want it to be as the most perfect product that I can make it. So I always do. She has to tell me to stop. She sent me a message, I think, a few days ago, just saying, "Rebecca, stop now," because I can just go on and on and on, trying to find the odd comma or apostrophe.
For people that haven't heard of Jewish Renaissance, can you sum up what the magazine is all about?
It's a quarterly arts and culture magazine. And what I love about it is that it's a diaspora magazine. So it's about life for us as Jews in the UK, in the UK Jewish diaspora, but it's also about Jews around the world. So not only do we have an international readership right across the world, actually we have readers from Australia through America, South America, South Africa, China, Japan. We cover communities and Jewish life around the world. And for me, that's really important. I don't think there's anything out there really that does what we do, especially in Europe. I think there's Hadassah magazine in America, which covers diaspora communities a little bit. But it's a wonderful feeling to feel that you're part of this worldwide community And it's important for me that the Jewish story is a diaspora story. A lot of our Jewish media tends to focus on Israel and the Holocaust, and they are important issues, but they're not the only issues. And being Jewish for me is about so much more than just those issues. We do cover Israel and we do cover the Holocaust, but we cover so much more. There is so much more. And what's more, there are stories that are not told and not heard, especially in our Jewish media, not really in any media, which are really worth hearing about our Jewish life in the UK before the Holocaust, from the medieval times through the 18th and 19th centuries, all of that, which there's so much that people don't know about it. And then in addition, we have a special section called Sephardi Renaissance. And this was a whole area that I personally knew nothing about, but the communities of Jews who lived in North Africa, the Middle East, or who came originally from Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, and were expelled during the Inquisition in medieval times. And those communities have ended up all over the world, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Japan, Turkey. So that's a story which is fascinating and is very different from, I think, if you grow up in the UK, especially, maybe you don't know much about that. You know a very sort of Polish, Russian, Eastern European, Ashkenazi story. And there, oh my goodness, there's this whole world. And there's obviously the Middle East communities, Iraq, Iran, Syria, wonderful, rich, vibrant histories that I certainly knew very little about. I think maybe many people also don't know much about that.
Fascinating, isn't it? And of course that's, in a way, part of the story about the Holocaust. And so much was lost, but life went on, and Jewish life and Jewish communities are very vibrant and very varied. And so it's important that these stories are told.
Yes, absolutely. And we're an arts magazine, so our main brief, our mission really, is to promote and introduce people to culture and arts, and all of these communities are part of this world of very wonderful, interesting theatre, music, literature.
Let's talk a little bit about the process. Your magazine comes out 4 times a year. For each edition, where does it start?
Usually in my head. I usually have a rough idea of what I would like the focus of upcoming, the next 1 or 2 or 3 upcoming issues to be. And the main theme of every issue is usually a country or a city or a region around the world and in the UK. So I will try and focus on, as I say, it can be a country, it can be a city sometimes. It's usually something where there is a newsy kind of link, or I'm getting a feeling, or I'm reading about trends are coming from this place. Or it could be something like in the lead up to the last US election, we did a big focus on, we did Washington DC as our special focus. For Olympic Games in Japan, we looked at Japan. So if possible, I like to have some kind of news connection. We covered Ukraine. Actually, we didn't focus on it recently because we'd done it a few years ago when I went to visit Ukraine to talk to people who've been affected by the invasion in the east by Russia, the Donbass region. So we did a big issue on Ukraine around 2014, 2015, and covered it then. But we did look at Lithuania recently as one of the countries that's being very affected by what's going on in Ukraine. So I try and keep it fairly news focused, not always, and sometimes it's just a sort of feeling that there's lots going on maybe with the Jewish community. For example, our current issue on Scotland, this has been, I sort of feel it's been on my radar for a while because I've been hearing lots of good things about what's going on culturally in Scotland with the Jewish Cultural Centre in Edinburgh and the Archive Centre in Glasgow. And Scotland has been in the news quite a bit over the last few years with regards the independence issue, obviously recently, in not such a good way with all of the political things going on with the SNP and the crisis that their leadership has been going through a little bit. Yeah, Scotland has been in the news a bit. And I've been meaning to do it for a while, and it just kind of felt like this was a good time. It's the lead up to Edinburgh. We've got the festivals. So it was felt like a good moment to focus on Scotland.
And I need to declare an interest here because you asked me to write a feature on the festivals and a little bit about the history of the festival and the festival open day, which I'm involved in at the Edinburgh Synagogue and is done in conjunction with the Kosher Centre. So you focus on different countries and different communities. How do you find your correspondence?
Yes, so that is quite hard because I like to use as much as possible people on the ground, so to speak. So local writers, journalists, novelists, poets. It's always much better if the people are there and can contribute because they know their stories so much better. And it just, for me, it has a more authentic feel, an interesting feel. It's really tricky. I mean, I do masses of research in the lead up to each issue. Firstly, to look at the place that we want to focus on, to see what's going on there. Is my feeling about this place right, that it's going to have some resonance and it will be interesting to people at this particular time, at this moment. But then also to try and track down people who can write for us. And that is hard. And it's often a case of I find one person and then it's a lot of asking, do you know someone else who might be able to write? So when we covered Brazil, which was our winter issue, I had a novelist and she recommended a few people. Yeah, it's very tricky. And the other thing that I find difficult is I love using people's local knowledge and local connections. But what makes a good local community leader might not necessarily make a good writer. So you're always balancing how to, I want to include those voices, but sometimes, but I also need to have really good writing because another thing I feel very passionate about the magazine is that it should be as professional as possible and have really good writing that's engaging and exciting and interesting to read. So I want the writing to be of a very high standard. So it's just trying to balance all of these things. I want to get good writers, but I don't want to get local people. So I suppose creatively it's challenging thinking how could I include people if they're not necessarily writers? So maybe, giving them another way of being involved with interviews, or they present walkabouts of the city or the country that we're doing, little personal guides. It's lovely. It's just thinking how to get into different subjects and approach them in different ways, and it allows you to be creative. And I love that process of thinking, how could we put this together? Could this be an interview, or could it be someone's diary, for example?
I noticed from your website you have an editorial advisory committee.
Yes.
How do they interact with the process?
So that's the other, you were asking how does the process start. We quite early on in the production cycle, so we work on a sort of 2-month editorial cycle really. The final month is really just getting the copy ready and really putting images in place, designing the magazine. So it's really a sort of 2-month period, and quite early in that we have an editorial meeting with a group of people who are an amazing group of people. They are all experts in their field, in areas of culture and heritage, arts organisation. They are terrific. And so I basically throw these ideas out and then they come back to me. When we meet up, they'll come back to me usually with suggestions of people that I mostly don't know or won't have heard of, but they'll know they have many years of experience and knowledge about their particular subjects. So I'm sure next week we're going to have our next editorial meeting, and I'm thinking that we'll probably do what was the former East Germany. I'm actually debating about what we do for our next issue. There was something I thought we'd do on Romania, but I'm now thinking I might change that.
So do you tend to work on one issue at a time?
I do, yeah. I'd rather not. I wish that I was far ahead enough in my planning that I didn't have to, because it is a lot to do. But so far, it's been quite hard to work on a future magazine because there's a lot to be done on my main focus has had to be on the magazine that I'm working on. I try and have a future plan of these are the areas I'm focusing on, but sometimes things come up. So something came up recently that made me think, oh, maybe I should do this focus on East Germany. It turns out there's a very big major exhibition at the Jewish Museum Berlin on East Germany and Jewish life in the former GDR.
You said before that there was a very small team that puts together a Jewish Renaissance. Can you tell me about the team and what they all do?
Yes, so it's not just Becky and me. It feels very intense in that final period, but there, of course, is an enormous number of other people who make it all happen. I should mention Danielle Goldstein, who has recently become my deputy editor. We didn't have a deputy editor, actually, for nearly all the time that I've worked at JR, which is now about 8 years. And I have felt that I've very much needed one. And Danielle, has been really responsible for all of our web content, editing the web content, technically getting it up there. And so that's the content on the homepage of our website. She puts up the blogs that we have. She really deals with all the technical aspects of it, as well as our social media. And we have a weekly newsletter that's emailed out to all of our subscribers and supporters. But her real love, and what I think is her forte, is her writing. She's very good at writing. I worked with her for many years at Time Out, where I worked before I started at JR. And she is a lovely writer. And I was just beginning to feel I need a little bit more help from someone who I can say to, could you just do me a 300 words on Shalom Aleichem? Could you put together a quick column on the latest books with a theme on Spanish Jewish history? Or, it's just having a bit more capacity would be great at my end. She's also our music editor, I should add, and she writes a lot of our music features. And she also does a lovely feature called Meet the Reader, MTR as we call it, where we ask our readers from all over the country, all over the world actually, we ask people to tell them a little bit about themselves and where they live. And we find out about their lives and what they like about JR and sometimes what they don't like, and their passions and interests in the Jewish world and in the non-Jewish world. Also, we have now Danny Silver, who is our editorial manager. She's now beginning to take on a bit of, or quite a lot of, what Danielle did. Danielle did all the listings in the magazine, which are then put up on the website on a weekly basis, and they go out into these newsletters that we send out. So Danny has now taken over quite a bit of that. She now does the writing of the listings, and that is a massive job because it's 3 months of listings of music, art, theatre, film, walks, lectures from all over the country, as well as some European cities and Israel, occasionally other places, but mostly that's the main focus. And the listings editor has to take all of this information, enormous amount, and make it into a digestible, informative, readable whole of, it's about 12 pages of listings that we have. That is a huge job. So she's taken that on, and she's also beginning to do other things as well. So some of the website stuff and social media. We have our operations manager, Ruth Bankover, who deals with our subscribers, enormous amount of administrative tasks that need doing, mail outs, being in touch. She's the person, so if you phone our office number, you'll reach Ruth. We have an advertising and finance manager, Lorraine Sheridan. We have a little team of volunteers that do an initial sub-edit, who have a lot of knowledge and experience of the Jewish world, so they can give an overview of the pieces. And that includes Janet Levin, who is the founder of Jewish Renaissance, who I must mention above all in this conversation. She founded JR just over 20 years ago, and she's been involved, obviously, as the founder and editor of the very first magazine up until I took over in 2014, 2015. I then finally took on the editorship, and she's still involved. So she's an amazing woman, full of ideas and inspiration, and she's still sub-editing for us, still sending me long emails and comments. We sub-edit over digital documents on Dropbox, and she sends me very lengthy and very detailed, but absolutely spot on, great comments, things that I think, oh my goodness, I absolutely need to take notice of this. She's so astute in all of her points, and perceptive, wonderful woman. We also have a programmer, Emma Brand, who, this is a relatively new post. Emma is involved in working on our online programs. So we've recently developed, really since COVID, we've developed a whole series of online programs. So we have a lecture series that we've been doing in conjunction with the West London Synagogue called the Lions Learning Programme, which covers things that we don't really cover in the magazine. For example, we had a whole series on medical ethics. We had a recent series on the Yishuv, the early period of settlement in Israel in the 20th century, and the early years of the Israeli state. We've had something on Jewish art. So that's a slightly separate program. But in addition to that, we have a quarterly launch of every magazine online. And we also have had book clubs. We have one-off lectures. So she deals with all of that, contacting people, making sure technically it runs smoothly. We often like to show films and images. And she's also beginning to work on other areas like our tours. We have our executive director, of course, Aviva Dorch, who is an amazing wealth of knowledge and experience in the Jewish and non-Jewish world. She's got a massive arts experience, working with everyone from the British Museum to the British Library and lots of other places. And she's a poet as well, published poet. She gets asked to speak at festivals. She's just come back from the Bradford Literary Festival, and she has so many contacts and ideas, and she's a wonderful resource and a great person to have on the JR team and leading JR. And she's got so many plans for JR's future. So yeah, she's very inspirational. We also have Judy Herman, I should mention, who does most of our podcasts, well, maybe I think all of our podcasts actually, and writes a lot of our blogs. And she's also our theatre writer, and she's got many years of experience in broadcasting.
So you've got your team, you've got your editorial committee, you've got your freelance contributors. That is a lot of people to manage, and a big responsibility for you as the editor. Can you tell me a bit about your journey to become an editor? How did you get into journalism? Where did it all begin?
Yeah, I didn't start off thinking I would be a journalist, actually. I didn't train as a journalist. I studied English at Cambridge, and I was always interested in theatre, actually, and drama. I thought maybe I'd go into that area. Also a bit in politics. When I was younger, I was interested in, but I didn't really know what I was going to do. So when I left college, I went to live in Japan, actually. I knew I wanted to live abroad, and I didn't just want to travel. I wanted to live somewhere and get to know life properly abroad. And I had a friend, Maya, who was studying Japanese, and so became interested in Japan through her. It just seemed like a good idea, as it does when you're 20, 21, to go far away and immerse yourself in a different culture.
And what did you do in Japan?
I started off teaching English. I taught in state primary schools. And then after a year, I began to work in a university, and I eventually, over the next few years, worked in very reputable universities in Tokyo. I was based in Tokyo.
So you learned to speak Japanese?
I did learn Japanese, I would say very poorly. I was not a good student, but enough to get by, to order my sushi, to make myself understood. You pick it up if you live there. I lived there a long time.
So from teaching...
Okay, so I'd been teaching about 4 years or so, and I began to feel, although I really liked teaching very much, and I was teaching literature, which I loved, I was a bit restless, and I felt that I wanted to write. I actually had always written from a very young age. From really, as a child, I'd put together magazines and stories. I'd always loved writing, but had never really thought much about it. And when I was at college, I wrote for magazines. I'd written bits of plays and things. I'd always loved writing. And I just remember I came back one summer to London to stay with my parents. And I just had this idea in my head about something that was going on in Tokyo at the time that was really bizarre. There was a whole trend. This was the mid-90s, and there was a phenomenon where quite young schoolgirls were dating older, they call them salarymen, and it was a sort of transaction. There wasn't sex. Sometimes I think there was, but wasn't necessarily sex involved in this. But they were basically being given Chanel bags. It was the time when there was a big boom in consumer brands, so Chanel and all of those. And basically these older businessmen, salarymen as they called them, were meeting young girls in cafes and restaurants. And it became such a trend that they even set up little cafes and restaurants, especially for this particular phenomenon that was happening. And it was all a bit disturbing and weird. So this was kind of playing in my mind that I wanted to write about it. It was a sort of, now we're used to hearing these kind of stories and sugar daddies and all that sort of thing. But then it was quite unusual. So I just started writing something, and it all kind of came out. And I, on a whim, sent it into Time Out magazine, which at the time had a travel section at the back called Dispatches, just quirky observations from people who lived around the world mostly. And so I wrote about this, and they just immediately said, "Oh, that's great, we'll print it." So I got my first piece printed in Time Out, which was great, and especially great because I guess it's the same in broadcasting, but once you've done something with a known name behind you, then you've got something to show other people. And I'd loved doing it. And from that, I just began to think, oh, I really enjoyed this, and started pitching ideas to Elle magazine, to newspapers here, because there was a fascination at the time with Tokyo. People didn't know a lot about it at that time, especially about young culture and trends, young people's trends, that kind of thing. So I pitched lots of ideas about fashion and music and clubs and all of these things that were going on in Japan. And people loved it here. So I ended up really just this one summer getting commissions to write about Japan from abroad. So from when I went back to live there. So I went back. I carried on teaching. I began to work as a stringer, they call it, in journalist speak, where I think broadcasting as well use stringer. Yeah, just reporting from around the world with stories. I was writing them for Elle and I did something on the homeless in Tokyo for the Big Issue. I just started writing quite a lot, and eventually approached a newspaper called the Japan Times, and went for a job there as a sub-editor, and that would also involve bits of writing for them. The Japan Times is an English language newspaper. It's the main English language newspaper in Japan. Yeah, so I gave up the teaching eventually after quite a while, about 5 or 6 years, and went to work at this newspaper in the middle of Tokyo. And it was an incredibly steep learning curve. I'd never worked in journalism in any formal way before. I was doing night shifts, and it was a real, proper newspaper. It went back to the 19th century, and had a very good reputation. Massive team of journalists and editors. I was on the domestic desk, and it was just a fantastic learning experience. So anyway, that got me into journalism proper and taught. It was, as I say, it was a steep learning curve because I'd had no training and no experience. So I really got all of that on the job, and then came back to the UK eventually after a few years working there, and came back and tried to find a job. I freelanced for a while working on things like Virgin Atlantic magazines and train supplements, all of that sort of stuff, and carried on pitching to newspapers, wrote bits for the Guardian or everywhere actually, Express, and did bits for the BBC. Eventually I got a job at Time Out working on their newly created website, and we were there right at the beginning, really working on, they had consumer pages, and I think because of this background I'd had in Japan, they made me consumer editor, which felt quite strange because although I'd written a lot about consumer trends and interests, it wasn't my complete passion. But it was, again, a great experience and just good to be working at Time Out. At the same time as I worked there, I started to write news pieces, which was what I was really interested in doing, really much more news and social trends, that sort of area. And then I went to work at The Guardian, working on the Guardian Guide, and I was there for about 2.5 years maybe, putting together their arts and culture supplements, sub-editing and writing bits for it, and then contributing also to the newspaper. So that was great. It was just really lovely, building up more and more experience. And at the same time, I was still writing news stories for the news desk at Time Out in a freelance capacity. And then it just happened by chance, both the news editors at Time Out left at the same time. And the editors said, we quickly need a news journalist to take over. They asked them who they recommended, and because I'd been working a lot for them and doing some shifts there as well, they said, get Rebecca in. And that was it in terms of, sort of getting to where I had wanted to go to for that stage. So then I became the news editor at Time Out. And it was a fantastic job, I have to say. It was absolutely fabulous because you were at the centre of everything, the capital, the world of the capital, and the...
So you've had a very wide range of experience working with very different newspapers and publications and gathered all this experience. What's the most difficult thing about being the editor? Is it dealing with contributors who don't deliver on time or give you something that you didn't expect? Or
the most difficult thing. I think it's that, it's the weight of responsibility, because at the end of the day, because we're a small team, although now we are increasing, and I'm getting this support now from my deputy editor, and our team is increasing. But it's the responsibility, at the end of the day, it's on your shoulders. The magazine has to come out and you have to deliver. And I just want it to be good and to be not have mistakes in it and to be interesting and engaging. So the challenge for me was to get it out in the first place with a small team. And also, I think coming from this more mainstream world of journalism, I mean, at Time Out, it was quite easy. As I say, people enjoyed, if you said you're from Time Out, we want to interview you, people responded immediately. I never really had to chase, you didn't have to chase politicians or people in the public eye. I mean, other people, dangerous, if you were tracking a news story and you wanted to find people involved in drugs or dangerous dogs or terrorism, whatever, that was a different thing. But people would speak to you very readily. So actually one of the challenges, and something which I enjoy and thought about quite a bit when I decided to get involved in JR, is that a lot of people haven't heard of Jewish Renaissance. So I have to think of ways of getting people to speak to me and connecting with people, getting in touch with them. And so the better I make the magazine, the more attractive it is to people who say, well, what is it you do then? What's the magazine? It's our calling card in a way. And so I think as it has expanded and as it's changed its look and design and some of its content, it's always been a great magazine, but I think sometimes it's just presentationally, it needed to be something that we could use to attract people to speak to us and to be involved with Jewish Renaissance. So sometimes that's been a challenge, that it's a small independent magazine, people haven't heard of it. So sometimes to get people to be involved or talk to you, you've had to really show them that you're professional and this is what we do and this is our mission. And now I have to say we are really expanding and placing ourselves as spokespeople or as a place that is really representing Jewish culture and arts, and we're maybe becoming more of a go-to organisation than we were in the past as our profile is rising.
From looking at your website, what I've realised more and more is that Jewish Renaissance isn't just that print magazine. There's so much more that you're now doing, which hopefully I would imagine expands your readership.
Yeah, so this is, especially since COVID, we've been really expanding online. So as I mentioned before, we have these programs of talks on art, usually arts and culture based, looking at, as I say, Jewish art and a whole area of different things. And we have the online launches every 3 months which are on the magazine. We launch the magazine online. And yes, we have a very extensive online program, but we also, and this has been something JR's done from fairly early on, is to have tours across the world. We travel to Ethiopia, we've got one coming up next year to India. We do shorter ones to Paris. We did a history trip to the Isle of Man recently, focusing on the wartime internment camps on the Isle of Man. We've done a lot, actually. Uzbekistan, China, yes, many many places, and we've got plans to tour to many other places. And our tours are regarded very well. People who've been on one often come back and book many more. As I say, the ones coming up, you can find out about those. India is the one that's coming to mind. We possibly are looking also at Uzbekistan again. And we've got a shorter Paris one coming up next year. So those you can find out on our website at jewishrenaissance.org, www.jewishrenaissance.org. If you look up the tours page, you can see what we've got coming up. We've also published a book in the last few years, our first book with the History Press. That was our one way of marking our 20th anniversary. And it was looking at 20 years of Jewish culture, taking 9/11 really as the starting point and looking at how that affected culture and what has been presented in terms of culture on the stage, in music, in film, theatre, literature, and looking at how Jewish culture has interacted with other cultures, especially Arabic, Muslim culture. And we have a series of 5 essays from experts in these 5 different fields talking about how Jewish culture has developed and changed and the challenges it faces over the last 20 years. The book's called The Age of Confidence. And we also have, we've now expanded, we have a lot of activity on our social media. We have events. We've had some one-off events, such as our lovely summer gala we had last year to celebrate our 20 years that we held in the centre of London with a big marquee and performers, including Michael Rosen and Maureen Lipman and her daughter, giving little talks and performances with tea and drinks. That was a lovely event. And we're occasionally doing small music event. We've done a music event in the past. We have an online book club, and we've got plans for more in-person events now that things have moved on post-COVID. So I must also mention our emerging journalism workshops and prize that we're running from November, so November coming up this year, which is open to people who are interested in getting into journalism or maybe who are beginning their careers in journalism and want some tips or techniques in how to develop and improve their work. We'll be running a series of weekly online courses with people who work in journalism, Raphael Baer, Hepzibah Anderson, other people from magazines and newspapers, Jonathan Friedland's probably going to be involved. We need to pin that down with him. And we'll be also having panellists discussing their experiences in journalism, the film editor of The Guardian, Andrew Pulver, and many other people who have made a career in journalism. And what we're hoping to do with that is to develop writing that might include talking about Jewish identity or issues that are connected with being Jewish, and that could also be that could be Israel, the Holocaust, as well as the wider areas of diaspora Jewry, or maybe in less obvious ways in which being Jewish and identity permeates one's writing or journalism. So we're looking at developing good writers. We have a prize at the end of the sessions, at the end of these, it's nearly 3 months of sessions. We'll have a journalism prize that will be judged by a panel of journalists. As I say, Raphael Baer is one of the judges, and we ran this in the past, and we had a panel with Raphael and Jonathan Friedland and various other journalists. For the future, we're looking at theatre makers, actually. That's the other area. How to present Jewish heritage on stage and in theatre, and looking at that heritage in its full complexity and inclusivity and diversity, whether that's 18th century Sephardi Jews in London or contemporary young Jewish experience, gay Jewish experience. We feel that there's a lot of Jewish life that is not often heard or seen, and we would like to address that, looking at theatre making and also looking at the regions. So we have readers all over the UK, many Scottish readers and supporters, as I discovered working on our latest issue, but also all over the country. And so we want to develop more connection with those readers, but also this theatre programme we're hoping will be a regionally based programme that will enable Jewish theatre to go on in regions around the UK. So that's just a few other things that we're doing.
That sounds really great. It's great that you're encouraging things, developing things.
Yeah.
It's lovely. Now, this edition has got special features on Scotland. So what are people going to discover when they open the pages?
Thank you. Yes, it is a lovely issue. It's so colourful somehow, and it's not just the fact that we have a very vibrant cover. I'm just flicking through it at the moment, but it really pops out, and I think a lot of that is to do with the subject matter, which I found lovely and interesting and yes, colourful and vibrant to work on. People were very passionate in Scotland about this Jewish Scottish identity. So I'll give you a quick whistle-stop tour of the Scotland part of the issue to start with. We have an overview from Harvey Kaplan, who's the director of the Scottish Jewish Archives in Glasgow, and he gives us an overview of Scottish Jewish heritage, but he also does a little walking tour of Glasgow and talks a bit about Garnet Hill Synagogue, the refugees and their legacy, and especially the artists such as Benno Schotz, who became prominent in Glasgow art and culture. We've got poetry from David Blyman, who uses bits of Scottish dialect and Yiddish words and combines them in an interesting way in his poetry to create very distinctive poetry. And we speak to people all over Scotland, to Evan in Aberdeen, who is a young man involved in promoting and preserving Jewish life in Aberdeen. He's very involved in Aberdeen Synagogue. We've got Emily Michelson in St Andrews, who's an academic, who talks about being part of a very small community there and how she's passing on Jewish traditions to her children against quite a lot of challenges because there are very few other Jews living in St Andrews. We speak to Mark Cohen in Glasgow, the owner of Mark's Deli, who tells us about his kosher haggis that has been sent all over the world, apparently.
Very important.
Very important, yes.
Very important if you're a vegetarian like me.
Yes, so we speak to Mark, we speak to Gary Friedman, who's a petrol station manager in Inverness. And it's lovely hearing about people living in the more remote corners of the country. And we spoke to Joe Isaac, who was a co-founder of the Pink Peacock Cafe in Glasgow, which very sadly closed just as we were going to press. And that is, as I say, that is a sad story because it hints at anti-Semitism, which we actually didn't go into very much in this issue, but I do get a feeling that maybe is something more that maybe later could be explored further, but it seems as if it was a problem. People mention it, did mention it when I spoke to them about living in Scotland, that there was a level of ignorance. Maybe it's experienced everywhere, but I got a sense that anti-Semitism was a bit of a problem and had been particularly in this closure of the cafe. So that was sad to hear about. But Joe wants to continue to do the sort of things that the cafe was doing, anarchist, very cultural, he says, we offered an alternative space for Jewish life. If you're queer, young and trans or anti-Zionist, mainstream synagogues can have real and internalized barriers. So I think they were trying to do something different. We've got a piece by Ellen Galford about Edinburgh, which has become her adopted home over the last 50 years. And she writes about its history and the very lively contemporary Jewish scene that's still there. And we also have something on the artists who came to live in Scotland, mostly at the end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. And some of them stayed, some of them were there for a bit. people such as Jankel Adler and Joseph Herman, and others such as Hannah Frank, who came from immigrant families and did lovely and distinctive work. We also have a little bit in that about how their work has inspired Scottish artists, and they are looked at as a very formative part of Scottish artistic legacy, the Scottish artistic legacy. Yes, we've also got something on Glasgow's Yiddish theatre, focusing in particular on the actor Ida Schuster in a lovely piece by Mia Spiro. And that was lovely. And talking about Avram Greenbaum, the poet and playwright, who I hadn't known about any of this, but there was a really thriving and lively Yiddish theatre scene in the city in the 40s and 50s. And we've got something on a Yiddish poet called Avram Radutsky, and that's in a lovely piece by Phil Alexander. We've got your lovely piece, David, about Edinburgh, which is terrific. So we learn a little bit about the background to the Edinburgh Festival, which was started by Rudolph Bing just after the war. Is that right?
1947.
Yes, 1947. Yeah. And that was very interesting. And David, you tell us about your idea to start the open day at Edinburgh Synagogue, so the festival open day, how that has developed and now showcases Jewish performances and performers from all over the world, and gives people a little preview, or sometimes it's in the middle of the festival as well, isn't it?
It's always in the middle of the festival.
Okay,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So, I trained in drama in Edinburgh and have been in the festival in one way or another for years. And, you notice that there are other Jewish productions going on, or Jewish musicians, or people that are not Jewish doing things that relate to Jewish themes. And I thought the open day would be a great way of bringing these shows to more prominence.
Yeah, lovely idea. Yes, lovely idea. And you pick out 3 recommendations. Some of them are at the open day and others are at the fringe in general. So that's a great piece and useful. I think our readers are very interested and go to the Edinburgh Festival and the Fringe and the other festivals in Edinburgh at the time. So I think they find all of this very useful. And the final piece we've got is on tartan and kilts, which I just loved this piece, I have to say, because the idea of having Jewish tartans, specifically Jewish tartans, was terrific and very intriguing. And I loved the fact as well that we spoke to a kilt maker in Edinburgh, Howie Nicholsby, who is a 4th generation Scottish Jewish kilt maker based in Edinburgh, and he's worn a kilt every day since he was 21. So yes, it's a lovely piece about contemporary wearers of kilts and tartan, and also Bernat Klein, who was a designer and artist who lived on the borders and he didn't like to call it tartan apparently, he called it plaid, but who used traditional Scottish designs in his work, very modernist work. So that's our Scottish section. Elsewhere, because we have reviews across the world of arts, so we have in our arts section a review by Monica Bohm-Dushan on the exhibition going on in Hastings at the moment on Soutine and Kossoff, Chaim Soutine and Leon Kossoff. And their Jewish connections. We've got a great interview from one of my Israeli writers with the grandson of Golda Meir, and his name is Shal Rahabi, and he talks about his grandmother and her legacy. He's trying to rehabilitate legacy a little bit. It's a very interesting interview. We've got a new indie pop singer called Catherine Bulthuis, who has a project that combines Yiddish and indie synth pop. Who knew? We've got a great interview with the author Linda Grant, by the former MP Louise Ellman. Louise was one of Liverpool's MPs, and Linda's 9th novel is about Liverpool, and she talks a lot. It's a lovely interview. She talks a lot about growing up in the area where the Beatles were growing up and knowing them, and about growing up in Liverpool and the Liverpool Jewish suburbs that people don't know about very much. We've got an interview with Laura Siegel, the Kindertransport refugee who came to Britain originally as a child and then went to live in America. She's now in her 90s and she's written her latest book. She's a great writer. And we also have something on Philip Roth and conflict, how he covers conflict in his, well, not just his novels, but he was a war reporter, a sports reporter, and a journalist. So how he interprets conflict in his work. Got Julia Neuberger on a biography of Golda Meir, and lots of books, stuff in we have a special section, as I mentioned before, Sephardi Renaissance, that looks at the Sephardi world. And we look at a new piece of music that's been commissioned especially to evoke ancient Jewish life in Iraq. And that has been composed by Roxana Panufnik, and Margaret Fingerhut is the pianist. And we have also a lovely piece on the late photographer Dorothy Bohm, who died in March, and we celebrate her life and her work in the front part of the magazine. Actually, I should mention we've got a very good piece. People might know the author Rebecca Abrams, who's written a lot about Jewish history, and she writes a great piece following the announcement of the closure of London's Jewish Museum. She talks about the future of Jewish culture in the UK in a really interesting piece that touches on also the Holocaust Memorial that's being planned for Westminster. So, yes, that's a quick whistle-stop tour of our magazine.
Yes. Wow. Everybody should rush out and get their copy of Jewish Renaissance.
Rush and get your copy. If you're not a subscriber, I don't know how that can be, but if you're not, then go to our website, which is jewishrenaissance.org, and you can go to the menu, which you can either subscribe online or you can call us and do it over the phone. We have apps. We have subscriptions if you live abroad. And we're still very reasonably priced.
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much for giving us your time and being part of our new podcast series. It's great to share this with Jewish Renaissance, and even more delightful given that this edition features so heavily on Scotland, but there's so much to discover about other Jewish communities throughout the world. So fascinating. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, David. And congratulations, Mazel Tov on the new podcast.
Well, wait till you hear it before you say it. But yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Auld Lang Schmooze, the Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre podcast. If you want to sign up to the Cultural Centre's newsletter and keep up with events online and live, go to our website at www.jcc.scot. This podcast was presented and produced by me, David Ian Neville, with music by Phil Alexander.